This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net.
This video is to explain aspects of why the American and European campuses are so ignorant about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
We're here on campus at the University of California at Berkeley to find out how offensive students find the ISIS flag.
Even the liberal Jews in America, they lack the perception of how the erroneous things got into the culture of the universities and into the liberal culture of modern Western society. Three things have come to my attention here, and I'll put them together to explain. With the background, I was studying the Spanish Inquisition, or the Inquisitions in total, from the history of the Christian Church. This is an excellent history of the Inquisition from a Protestant European perspective of the 1700s, and gain some insight. But here, this week, a young man took a Islamic State flag and waved it over at the steps of a university in California. I think it was Berkeley, and the main comment was "good luck," and nothing, while he's saying all kinds of things to propagandize the Islamic State. Then he took a Jewish flag, and there was much resentment and verbal attack. I do understand why. Even the Jews in America, many are against Judaism, if not against Israel.
We're here on campus at the University of California at Berkeley to find out how offensive students find the ISIS flag.
ISIS is misunderstood. We just want our own state. Why does America keep bombing us? America and Western imperialism are to blame, not ISIS. We just want a state of our own. An Islamic state, no different than America. We do not want to hurt anybody else. We don't have to hurt them. Why is America killing us? They're killing innocent civilians. America is causing the death in Iraq and in Syria. America is to blame for the deaths in Syria, not ISIS, not Islamic State.
Good luck.
Thank you, sir. The blood of the Middle East is on the hands of America. American imperialism is responsible for death all around the world. Right? That's right. We are ISIS. We are love. We don't want to harm anybody. We're forced to by American imperialism and American laws. Right? Right on.
Can't smoke on campus. They're going to cite you.
Oh, all right. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Then again, tolerance has always been an important value at Berkeley.
Israel's what? I don't even know what that means, sir. And what's Hamas is a great place, right? Israel protects Palestinian human rights. Yes, it does. Israel protects. Only Hamas is responsible. Right? You agree with that?
No, not really.
You don't agree with that? You don't agree that Hamas is a terrorist organization? Is Hamas a terrorist organization? Excuse me? That's the way you respond? I can't hear what you're saying.
All of Israel killer.
All of Israel are killers and Hamas are not killers?
No.
Tyranny isn't cute.
What? Isn't cute? Right, tyranny's not cute. Hamas is not cute.
That flag you wave is the psychological genocide of this planet.
That's sick.
killing kids.
I'm sick? Yes. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Do you not agree with that, sir?
Whatever. No, free Palestine and Israel, dude.
This institution is part of the people who enslaved the whole planet.
I would add a little insight here about Jewishness. The big difference between conservative and liberal Jews. Wonderful as I fly back and forth 4 times a year to Russia. There's usually Jewish on the plane, and the loving, caring Jewish mothers are very impressed. But my earlier experience, I was attending the University of Buffalo during the Vietnam War, and there were all these protests and everything. And the liberal Jew professors were leaders in that. But the other main point I remember from those days was on the days that there were Jewish holidays that the Jewish girls didn't come to school, the female students were all dressed modestly with dresses. As soon as the Jewish holidays were over, back was the liberal dress with pants. And here the liberal dressing at the university at that time, this was during the Vietnam War, were these liberal Jews, and the female Jews had a tremendous reputation for liking to play around with non-Jews. But that is not a clear picture of the Jews. The Jewish religion and the Muslim religion, the Muslim really copied much of the Judaism, has a strict role for men and women to have women be good mothers and homemakers. And the rebellion exists in both cultures, women's liberation. The difference is in a Muslim culture, she might get killed. In the Jewish culture, the liberated men and women who rebel against Judaism are rejected by the family, but they're not stoned or killed. That's just a little insight into the Judaism and how it plays out at some times. I've had Jewish friends and known Jews all my life, and many different personalities. I enjoy the Orthodox Jews traveling to some saint worship in Ukraine many times, and I don't know whether it's spring or fall, but I happened to be on the plane at the same time that they're traveling to worship some old rabbi that a couple hundred years ago lived in Ukraine. And there was a rabbi that led a bunch of Ukrainian farmer Jews to become Christian and all these things. But that's besides, that's off the track for now. But just a little insight about Judaism on the campus, that there's a big difference between the Orthodox Jews and the rebellious Jews. I'm interrupting this first part. It was recorded yesterday, the Saturday, the November 29th of 2014. Today is Sunday. And I was so devastated from what I saw with this Imam Rauf and the PBS propaganda funded by public funds that but we had today we had a nice home church meeting with 4 people giving their testimony and prayers and asking for the guidance to make a better world for ourselves and others. And maybe I have the strength to go on with this project, which is so painful because there's so much deception and it's growing. But I'll get on with it.
Announcing Book 5 of the Crackpot Conspiracy Series. Islamic World Domination, Fact or Fiction by Martin and Patricia Riot is now available at Amazon. Is Islam really a religion of peace? Do you believe the war on terror is really over, as the Obama administration claims? Do you believe the ongoing jihadist attacks around the globe are peaceful? Did you know that the Quran, or Quran, the holy book of Islam, commands its followers to spread Islam by the sword? And Muslims have been doing just that for centuries. The Quran also instructs its followers to lie, that's known as taqiyya, or to lie by omission, known as kitman, in order to spread Islam. But one of the biggest lies is that Islam is a religion of peace. Instead, Islam is a religion of war, violence, and vengeance to be spread by the sword. The goal of Islam is that Allah's word and religion reign supreme. According to the Quran, the holy book of Muslims and Islam, Muslims are to pretend to be friendly to unbelievers until strong enough to overcome them. Then, Muslims are to make war against unbelievers, that's non-Muslims, converting them by the sword. Also, according to the Quran, any people conquered by the sword must then convert to Islam, or submit to virtual slavery, or be killed. Some list of choices, huh?
And that's what happened in Spain for 700 years. Churches were destroyed, mosques were built, the Jews were their enforcers and collectors and doctors and lawyers and accountants. But the Christians had to submit. If they protested, there were beheadings. They had to supply the Muslims with virgin daughters for the harems in North Africa. Look at the North African, how many look like Europeans, where it came from. Follow the genetics and you'll see the reality. But let's get on with it. Another thing often swept under the rug was the horrendous amount of rape. Wherever Muslims move in, the non-Muslim woman, if they go on the street unaccompanied, they're asking to be raped.
Something else that Muslim immigration appears to have brought to Norway is what some here call a rape epidemic. Recent police statistics showed that in the capital of Oslo, 100% of assault rapes between strangers were committed by immigrant non-Western males, and 9 out of 10 of their victims were native Norwegian women. Some blonde Norwegian women have reportedly begun dyeing their hair black, and many travel only in groups.
Velkommen til Dagsrevyen. Alle overfallsvoldtektene i Oslo i fjor ble begått av menn med ikke-vestlig bakgrunn, viser en rapport politiet la fram i dag.
Det betyr at samtlige overfallsvoldtekter med kjent gjerningsmann de siste 5 årene begått av menn av uten.
My wife grew up in a Russian home church farm town in Armenia. And in her high school, she had an Armenian friend and they would talk. And my wife was blonde. And they were talking about hair color and appearance. And the Armenian friend broke down and cried. She said the Armenians used to be fair complected with light hair too, but they've just been raped so much by the Turkish Muslims. Now, going back to Islamic Spain, where the rape was endemic of the Christian girls if they were out of the home without their father or brother.
The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus is about to embark on his world-shattering voyage to the Americas. And on his way to the coast, he stops off here at Granada. He's the honoured guest of a ceremony hosted by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. They are celebrating a grand victory. Up until this day, Granada had been ruled by Muslims. But Isabella has managed to wrestle control from them.
Ferdinand and Isabella's victory marks a turning point for Spain and for Europe. The Middle Ages are over, and the West is about to embark on a new epoch of power and discovery.
We tend to think of this as the beginning of an era. In fact, it's the climax of a forgotten chapter in European history. The rise and fall of Islam in the West.
Let me interrupt this false sophistry for a moment just to say that this mechanism that is so elegant was part of what was produced in trying to make a moon calendar.
But they haven't always lived such separate lives. In the year 711 AD, Muslim forces invaded Spain and created a society so rich and so powerful it was the envy of the known world.
Please understand, this is part of the false propaganda that was initially propagated by the Jews that escaped the Inquisition.
This wasn't the rigid, ferocious Islam of our imaginations, but a progressive, sensuous, intellectually curious culture.
But filled with rape of Christian girls, the occasional beheading, the destruction of churches, and the demand for Christian virgins for the harems. Oh, and let me mention the overbearing tax often collected by Jews to build these monuments to Islam.
That for a number of spine-tingling years looks set to sweep through the whole of Europe. It is an incredible story, but one that has been systematically written out of history.
After the Catholic monarchs took over the city of Granada, they began to destroy all evidence that the Muslims had ever been in Spain. In the following century, the Spanish authorities persecuted and expelled 300,000 Muslims and burned as many as 1 million Arabic books. This was an astonishing act of ethnic cleansing. It put an end to a civilization which had flourished in Spain for 700 years. These people have become known as the Moors.
Propaganda, sparked by the Crusades, has given us an enduring image. The diabolical Moor, a dark-skinned, savage, alien enemy.
But this character is a complete invention and tells us nothing about who these people really were.
I'm going to stop this perversion of history to get on with it, but there'll be more presented at Imam Rolf. Let me give some insight into why the Christians were not respected. They were Trinitarians. The Roman Catholic Church implemented a dogma that the home Christians who followed that Jesus said the Father is greater than I. They called them Arians after Bishop Arius. They were killed, their property taken by the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church had dominated the upper class lords had converted from home church Arian Christianity to the Catholicism, and that Trinitarian belief was part of Spain, and the Muslims had contempt for elevating anything. There's only one God, Allah, and that the Jews at least only worship one God. But that's the origin of the differentiation there, the Trinitarianism, which was not part of Christianity in its foundation. It was not part of the Gothic conversion to home church Christianity around the Black Sea. There's a Muslim Turkish professor that discovered this old language and wrote a book, I should say published a journal article about the founding by the original apostles, and Peter and his wife, Andrew and maybe his sister, and Paul and his companions all established churches that grew in that spread Christianity out around the Black Sea into the breadbasket, where there were farm homes, and it was home churches, which led then the Goths expanded, and their lords they were very fierce and strong people, but they built churches and built homes and defended and took and made farms all around the Alps. That's where the Amish and Mennonite foundation goes back all the way to the home church founded by the apostles. The loving environment of a home church family is what makes this godly, peaceful nature that you can find in many Buddhists around the farm areas of China and India before it got completely dominated by the cult of Hinduism, which has the caste system and keeps some born to clean toilets. But that's a whole nother story. Let's get on with this story now.
Make no mistake about it. The goal of Islam is Islamic world domination, and that's as instructed by their holy book, the Quran. Allah will only be satisfied when the entire world is Muslim. The teachings of the Quran, the basis of Sharia law, give no rights to women or children, and Islamic supremacists are pushing to have Sharia law in the USA. Islamic supremacists are working in the USA and around the globe to gain the power necessary to overthrow and dominate all infidels, and that would be us, folks. Islamic supremacists are using taqiyya, remember that's lying commanded by the Quran, to lull us into accepting Sharia law and eventual Muslim domination. Barack Hussein Obama is allowing infiltration into the highest levels of our government to these Islamic supremacists who have sworn to destroy us from within by our own hands. Obama is even allowing Islamic supremacists into sensitive positions of national security and national defense. We ask you again, do you believe Islam is a religion of peace? Do you believe the war on terror is over? Get your copy today of Islamic World Domination, Fact or Fiction by Martin and Patricia Riot, and discover the truth for yourself. Islamic World Domination, Fact or Fiction by Martin and Patricia Riot is now available at Amazon.com.
I was devastated in my background work for the video when I ran across this PBS video produced by Imam Rauf, and the devastating deception with the background that I've gained through all the terrorism I've had to walk through here in Russia, and studying the Quran and the history, and knowing that the land of the seven churches, that the Christians have all been exterminated, and that's now Turkey. And now the Western academic literature is corrupted by the Muslim cooperating Jews that escaped from Spain and went to the universities and demonized the Christians that fought and demonized the Christians that went and suffered and died horrendously trying to protect right of access to the holy sites. Understand here, Luther's rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church was a rational process of integrity, but the hatred and resentment that followed from the Protestants for the Catholics, much of it was fueled by this Jewish resentment of the Inquisition. And that is what is turned in Western society, in the universities, the liberals, to be against not just the Christians, crusaders, but just think about it. It's like the Christians trying to recover their land from the Muslims and the Holy Land to be able to go to Jerusalem. And that's what the Jews are doing today. And do you wonder why there's the resentment on the part of the liberals? Read all this resentment towards the Catholic and Christian church, and they've turned against Christianity and they've turned against Judaism. And look at how many are supporting Islam. There's other reasons behind that too, of using fear and women being attracted to the invader, but those are different things. And then to demonize them for this. It's true, there were, as in all aristocracies, the women hire babysitters, and their children of the upper class are corrupted, sociopathic, sadomasochistic, and there were Catholic lords like that, yes, but to use that as to disgrace the desire to live in peace and as Jesus taught, and to go and rescue the Holy Land from these murderous invasions of Muslims, doing what the Quran says, what these children are being indoctrinated to memorize, so they'll put on bombs and go, or you can blow up the World Trade Center, and the Muslims that were in there, they go to heaven. That's not a problem. It's an honor for them. Wake up. Wake up. And the 3 young men that were tortured and their throats slit for publishing Bibles, and the 5 men who did it were caught at the scene, and Erdogan has let them go home. He blamed the secular generals when the 5 young men clearly said they were there supporting the Islamist AKP and Erdogan. That's another story. That I was devastated to see the false propaganda, and that PBS is publishing it.
We lounge beneath the pomegranates, palm trees, apple trees, under every lovely leafy thing, and walk among the vines, enjoy the splendid faces we will see in a lofty palace built of noble stones.
This video was produced by people working at behest of Imam Rolf, who is the ground zero mosque imam, who also has founded the Cordova Society to glamorize and falsify the history of Islam in Spain.
Over 1,000 years ago, the sun-washed land of southern Spain was home to Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together and flourishing. Their culture and beliefs intertwined, and the knowledge of the ancients was gathered and reborn. Here were the very seeds of the Renaissance. But this world too quickly vanished. Greed, fear, and intolerance swept it away. Puritanical judgments and absolutism snuffed out the light of learning. Within a few centuries, the fragile union of these people dissipated like smoke. The time of tolerance was lost forever.
To counteract these false projections, I'm going to show you a clip on what these people following the Quran did as they invaded Egypt and what they did to the library at Alexandria.
The Alexandrian Library was once the largest library in the world. A bibliophile's greatest dream come true. At its highest point, the library held over 700,000 scrolls. But like all good things, it came to an end. We arrive now in the middle of Muslim conquest. The Muslim forces are marching across North Africa and taking land in the name of Islam. When the Muslim flag approached the gates of Alexandria, they prepared for battle and fought. The Alexandrians, however, surrendered when casualties became too great. When the Muslim general came across the library, he requested counsel from Caliph Omar for his next actions. The Caliph sent a letter back saying, "They will either contradict the Quran, in which case they are heresy, or they will agree with it, so they are superfluous." So, the library's books were used to feed the fires of the bathhouses in Alexandria. Some scholars debate over this, since the Bible and Torah can't be destroyed because of their connection to the Quran. No one knows if the entire collection in the library was destroyed, or if the Bible and Torah were spared. It is a tragedy that hundreds of thousands of invaluable scrolls were burned because of their disagreement to a religion.
In the 5th century, Rome is sacked by a tribe of Visigoths, driven by their need for land and plunder. All over Europe, barbarian tribes descend upon the once great Roman Empire.
The western lands of the Roman Empire, what we now call France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, England, those regions collapsed first. They were abandoned by Roman legions first.
And with the empire's decline, Europe enters a new age.
Historians don't like to use any longer the phrase Dark Ages. But truth be told, there was a lot that was dark about this time. The Roman Empire collapses. There's not as much trade. Many libraries are pillaged and wrecked, and some of the great classics disappear.
Forgive me, but this is such an evil corruption of truth. The Goths came from the same origin as the Vikings, a very honorable people who were fierce fighters for good, to make stable for themselves. Yes, they did conquer, but as the Goths came down, they became Christians and established home church farms. They were not pagan, cutting people in part in terror, and they were fierce warriors, making it a safe place wherever they went. And they were, before the conversion to Catholicism, they were Arian Christians from going back around 200 years after Christ, when they invaded in what's now Ukraine, and were converted to home church Christianity, to Arian Christianity. Their home church Christian culture that defended their home and land gave rise to three things that exist still today. In the Amish, the Mennonite, their foundation goes back to these home churches where there was a family meetings. The same thing, the Kazaki, which people who don't know, here in Russia still have them defending the borders and defending the streets, riding on horses. They're Christian now. They're the Kazaki were originally home Christians in the area of Ukraine and defended against Muslims. But look up Kazaki. They became Orthodox Catholic after the Queen of then Russia, which was out of Kiev, actually, was the head of Russia at that time. But the Kazaki, they still exist today and teach a culture of defending their land against the evil invasions. Millions of people have been subjugated in Russia. Tens of thousands taken as slaves. The Tartars sold slaves to the Turkish, who had murdered so many Christians in Turkey. But look into the history and don't be duped by this propaganda. And please understand, the Dark Ages, so-called, were not dark in Northern Europe. It was the spread of Arian Christianity. It was not under the Roman Church or the later Orthodox after the Queen of Russia had converted around 1,000. But at any rate, please understand, Northern Europe was a relatively peaceful place to live before the Orthodox Christianity, the worldly Christianity, took over from Arianism. That it was the peaceful Arianism that prospered for hundreds of years in Northern Europe. And then the degradation of the upper class, the women not wanting to care for their own children, hiring babysitters and wet nurses. And then what they call the Enlightenment or something. That was another corruption, really, of the affluent class. Look at me, look at me, look at all the men with their long hair and skirts, and the women, and all the corruption of the upper class. That's why they had the French Revolution and killed much of the priesthood and the priesthood, the wealthy, under this domination of the affluent class. The wealthy became either military officers or priests, their sons, because they didn't break up the power of the family. The eldest son inherited the power. So, but this is an upper class corruption. There was always, that's where the immigration to America came from. These farm home family Christians finding a safe place. They never submitted, and they weren't part of the evil garbage either. Look into it, this false history. And then the lords, Catholic lords of Northern Europe, again, they brought this corruption and domination, and they're not allowed to even learn to read and write unless you were there, the Jewish bookkeepers, lawyers, and doctors for the upper class lords who were corrupted. As I said, how their children get corrupted. It's like daycare today in the inner city. The bunch of selfish, guilt-driven, high incidence of homosexuality, brutality, sadomasochism. Look into it. It's very explainable. But don't get caught up in all this manipulation of the historical record to demonize what is good. It's in the middle. It isn't the dominant alpha male. It isn't the look at me, manipulative female attracted to the invader because that's what had babies. It's in the middle where Jesus brought us, that we have a direct relationship with our source of existence and a responsibility to care for children and respect life.
Poetry and science, medicine and mathematics, the great knowledge of the Romans and Greeks is lost.
And the lies about Islamic science rescuing the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans. Look at who burned the library at Alexandria. It was on the orders of a caliph. Then this stuff about, oh, there's so much math and astronomy from Islam, and all these stars named after Muslims. Yes, that's true, because the moon was Muhammad's background of worship, and he had a moon calendar for, it's still, Islam goes on a moon calendar. So as soon as they had, by the trick of fate of a sandstorm at their back, defeated the Persian army and set up Islam in what's now Iran, in Baghdad, the area of Baghdad, they brought astronomers and mathematicians from all over the world, Greek. It didn't make any difference what their religion was. They brought them from India. India, that's a whole nother story about the Indians picking up from the sailing people that set up those megaliths, and that they sailed by the stars. So the upper class sociopaths developed astrology to manipulate people with. But they did have star observations, and the Muslims made an institute to study, to try and find that perfect moon calendar. One of the definitions of insanity is to reason perfectly on a false assumption, which is an insanity, because the moon wobbles. The moon is affected by tides, and it's not a regular effect. So the moon wobbles, and you cannot make an accurate calendar based on the moon. Their ignorance of their Allah that told them to use the moon is obvious. And look at their magical birth from a blood clot, and their creation theory, and all of these things. Please.
In the wake of this violence, the barbarian tribes are still left homeless.
Please don't get caught by these lies and sophistry. The Goths came from Gotland. They were what would later be called Vikings, or were called Vikings, and they sailed down the coast into England. But this Goths, around 200, as they migrated down into what is now Ukraine, they were converted to Arianism. They're home church Christians. If you want to know what they looked like instead of this barbaric projection, yes, they were fierce defenders of their home and land, and they were had an honorable male culture from the thousands of years of sailing and mammoth hunting, where the men had to work together and the women were left, and the men come back to a respected home where the women were caring for their own children. That's a whole nother story. It was a powerful culture that was destroyed when Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden, was destroyed in the 30 Years' War. But that's a whole nother thing that was an outgrowth of this narrative that the Jews brought, that was behind the hate for the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Catholic conflict that killed King Gustavus Adolphus and destroyed that powerful Scandinavian foundation. But just like the foundation in Russia was destroyed by all the war in Afghanistan and the women and in the Second World War, and it gave destruction of the home culture. Let's get on with it.
They migrate across Europe, searching the Roman provinces for a land of their own.
When we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really not talking about a sudden collapse. In fact, some people have talked about it as a kind of quiet fall. What we should think of is different regions coming into crisis at different periods of time, and different forces of migration bringing about those crises.
The migrations bring a great movement and mixture of cultures into the remains of the broken empire. In 476, the Visigoth tribes reach westward to the isolated Roman peninsula of Iberia.
Look at the background of the Goths. This is where their home church, Arian Christian culture got corrupted by the worldly Roman church.
Gothic Christianity refers to the Christian religion of the Goths and sometimes the Gepids, Vandals, and Burgundians, who may have used Wyclif's translation of the Bible into Gothic and shared common doctrines and practices. Gothic Christianity is the earliest instance of the Christianization of a Germanic people, completed more than a century before the baptism of Frankish King Clovis I. While one might suppose that the Gothic churches of Europe were built by the Goths, this is not the case. Few structures dating to the Gothic era still exist in Europe, and those don't conform to the style of Gothic architecture, which dates to the 12th century. The term Gothic architecture was originally a derogatory term meaning something like crude and barbaric that did not really relate to the historical Goths. The Gothic tribes were predominantly Christian for more than a century, before they sacked Rome in the 5th century. The Gothic Christians were followers of a doctrine, homemaking, associated by their opponents with the priest Arius. Left square bracket 1 right square bracket. The theological differences between this and mainstream Trinitarian Christianity are discussed under Arianism. After their sack of Rome, the Visigoths moved on to occupy Spain and southern France. Having been driven out of France, the Spanish Goths formally embraced Catholicism at the Third Council of Toledo in 589.
Euphilus was a Gothic Christian missionary that invented the Gothic alphabet to write the Bible in the Gothic language in the mid-300s.
What we now call Spain and Portugal. And there they find Jews living in many of its cities, such as Cordoba, Granada, and Toledo.
It's possible that Jews lived and worked in Spain before Christians did. I mean, there are evidence of Jewish traders as early as the 1st century.
They came because there were business opportunities, and ambitious and clever people followed the trade routes. And that's always been true, not just for the Jews, but there was a great deal of travel all over the Mediterranean world in Roman times.
Jews had prospered for centuries under Roman rule, building a comfortable life for their families in their new Spanish homeland.
What was surprising to me was after the destruction of Jerusalem, when the Jews and Christians, many immigrated, Rome killed Christians, not Jews. I don't fully understand that. Maybe somebody else will show me later.
As the Visigoths come to rule Spain in the 5th century, the Jews hold their ancient traditions dear. They bake unleavened bread for Passover and prepare Sabbath dinners as they have for thousands of years. The 7th century Visigoth bishop Isidore of Seville writes, "Of all the lands from the west to the Indies, you, Spain, O sacred and always fortunate mother of princes and peoples, are the most beautiful. You are the pride and jewel of the world, the most illustrious part of the earth." For the first 100 years of Visigoth rule, the Jews enjoy relative freedom, but are never in a position of power. In the late 6th century, this growing religious tension erupts in violence as the Visigoths convert to Catholicism. and begin to actively persecute the Jews of Spain.
Most of the evidence that we have comes from a series of law codes which were promulgated by Visigothic kings and which typically restricted the action of Jews, forced them to convert, and ultimately enslaved them. And one great theologian at the time compares Judaism to a kind of cancer that has to get cut out before it spreads to the rest of the body, the Christian body.
Be careful with this narrative. It's meant to justify the Jewish complicity in the murder and rape and domination of Christians that is to come with the Islamic invasion and the Jewish complicity with the Muslims. But in fact, that complicity took place in Egypt and all across North Africa. The Jews and the Muslims worked together, and the Christians were in fact persecuted as they are still today in Egypt. The Jewish have fallen out of favor as their helper since the creation of Israel.
As these two faiths struggle, one for survival, one for dominance, a third Abrahamic religion is born, over 4,500 miles away, in an ancient city called Mecca. It is believed that the angel Gabriel appears before a man named Muhammad, instructing him to recite the words of God as revealed to him.
This set of revelations, these words, this scripture, which became known as the Quran, it speaks of prophets beginning with Adam and ending with Muhammad, of prophets that were sent to every community on earth.
These prophets include the ancient Jewish figure of Abraham, as well as the Christian Jesus, linking the new religion, called Islam, to the common books of both Judaism and Christianity.
This introduces you to the Imam Rauf, who's the Imam who's organizing the Ground Zero Mosque. And when he's talking about the third Abrahamic faith, according to the Quran and the teachings that he has to teach to Muslims, he can deceive non-Muslims. But Muhammad is the perfect prophet. Jesus exists in this book where it was supposed to be perfect directly from God, Allah, to his greatest prophet, Muhammad. And in it, Jesus is there, and he makes mud birds and blows on them and they fly away. That's in there twice. But Jesus is an inferior prophet to Muhammad. But Muhammad is perfect. He can marry a 6-year-old and have intercourse with her when she's 9. Read the book and look what they're justifying, that they would kill all these people and murder them because they show Muhammad with a bomb in his head, when Muhammad himself cut the heads off over 600 of a Jewish tribe when they wouldn't help him against his own polytheistic tribe. Look into it.
The Muslims share with Christians and Jews the concept of being called the people of a book.
Please understand, according to Islam, Jesus is not the Christ, and he was not crucified. But they have a narrative now to justify taking over the Temple Mount, that Muhammad went there and rose to heaven from the Temple Mount. Oh, and let me add, if you're caught in the 2 largest Islamic holy cities as a Christian, you can legally be murdered. You can't enter by law.
Ahl Kitab is the expression by which the Quran refers to Christians and Jews. Literally, it means people of a scripture, people who are a scriptured people. This is what joins and makes Muslims, Jews, and Christians feel they are part of a family.
Good evening. Up to 1,000 protesters have been demonstrating in the capital of Sudan, demanding that the jailed British teacher, Gillian Gibbons, be executed. They burned pictures of her and shouted that her 15-day sentence was too lenient. Mrs. Gibbons, who was in prison for letting one of her school children name a teddy bear Mohammed, has been moved to a jail at a secret location for her own safety. Tonight, the Muslim peer Lord Ahmed is on his way to Sudan to try to press for her early release. Adam Minot reports from Khartoum.
Fury in Khartoum, as many hundreds of people poured out of Friday prayers and onto the streets of the capital. There were elements of theatre about the protests, but genuine upset too. And from a hot-headed minority of the crowd, calls for Gillian Gibbons to be killed.
This old British lady, if I find her, I will kill her and behead her myself.
Sticks, swords and banners were waved in an outpouring of anger at her perceived insult to Islam.
Our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we love him very much. And we have a big, great red line in talking about him.
And she crossed the red line?
Yes, yes.
According to Islam, Muhammad is the final prophet. The new faith of Islam unites the tribes of Arabia and begins an astonishing wave of conquest across the Middle East, eventually establishing its capital in Damascus, Syria, before it spreads into North Africa.
So in that sense, we should think of the Muslims, in some way, as a migratory wave just like the Visigoths, except 200 years later.
I can't believe this, equating the home church Goths with the barbaric, murdering Islamists.
In North Africa, the growing Islamic empire gathers strength, converting large numbers of indigenous tribesmen called Amaziran, or as the Greeks named them, Berbers.
We don't know where the Amaziran came from, because they were always there. All the invaders found the Amaziran there.
By converting, the Berbers become part of the growing Islamic empire and are therefore provided protection. The Berber warriors proved useful in Islam's expansion as Arab leaders set their sights on the now vulnerable Visigoth kingdom of Spain.
Notice that the violence of the Berbers, just as the violence of the Arab desert tribes and the violence of the Turks coming out of the mountains, that it fit very well with this scheme of Muhammad, to pyramid scheme of rape, pillage, and plunder to establish a worldwide caliphate.
What they did was to use those fierce warriors, the Berbers, who were newly converted, and they used them, they got them involved in the empire. So the bulk of the people who invaded Iberia, which is Portugal and Spain, were Berbers or Amaziran.
A young newly converted Berber warrior named Tariq ibn Ziyad leads 7,000 men in an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. In 711, almost 100 years after its birth, Islam has crossed the narrow 8-mile Strait of Gibraltar that separates North Africa from the lands of Europe. In southern Spain, Tariq ibn Ziyad and his men faced the Visigoth king Rodrigo at the Battle of Guadalete. According to legend, Tariq addresses his men. At the moment when the two armies meet hand to hand, you will see me, never doubt it, seeking out this Rodrigo, tyrant of his people, challenging him to combat, if God is willing.
Nobody knows what happened. We don't really know, but we know that they were defeated. That's all we know.
This is simply not true. We do know that they met a weak Visigoth army and devastated them. Then they took a bunch of captives and slaughtered half or more of them and roasted their parts and sent the rest free to tell of the horror to come if they didn't submit to Islam. The unfortunate background to this is that the Goths, who followed Jesus Christ, who said you can have a relationship with your source of existence and you don't need to go through a priesthood. You can have a direct relationship with your source of existence. And they had this home church religion with their relationship with God, and the Catholic Church established itself as another priestly empire where the lords could get sanctification from the priests and they could dominate and control. They weren't even allowed to print the Bible. It's a complete corruption of the truth of Christ. But that's besides the point. So the Visigoths had converted to this worldly religion and given up the Jesus Christ of the Bible and turned to a priesthood again, and the corruption fell in. But to equate the Goths to the Muslims is a total corruption of truth.
In the epic battle between Muslim and Christian armies, Tariq emerges as a folk hero, leading his people to a new land. By 711, the Islamic Empire has reached Spain, a land already rich in Christian, Roman, Visigoth, and Jewish cultures. There, the Muslim leaders begin laying the foundation for a new Islamic kingdom in Europe. The Muslim armies find allies among the persecuted Jews in the conquered cities of Spain.
When the Arabs came in 711, the Jews were not unhappy, because that had to be an improvement. Any change would have been an improvement. And Islam brought certain advantages with it from a Jewish point, from a minority point of view.
According to legend, the Muslims supply many Jews with weapons to help battle the Visigoths.
And Muslim historians say that each time the Muslims took a city and wanted to move on, they did not have any people to leave garrisons behind them. Most of the time these were Jewish garrisons that took the city and kept it for them until they came back.
This much is true. In areas where there was a minority of Muslims and Jews, but the Muslims had dominated with the sword, the Jews were their helpers. Don't misunderstand, the same thing was true in Northern Europe. The Catholic lords used the Jews to subjugate the serfs. And the same thing with the minorities. The Roma at times under the Turkish Caliphate were enslaved into being warriors, and some submitted and helped the Muslims against the majority Christians.
The Islamic Empire holds most of the peninsula by 732. They call their new land Al-Andalus. Sadly, in 976, darkness falls on Al-Andalus as the death of Abdul Rahman III's successor begins a period of hostility and upheaval. Eventually, the kingdom descends into civil war as rebels ravage the countryside outside Cordoba.
Historians say that this general took over. He started killing anyone in sight because he was insecure and he wanted to put his house in order. And it went like this.
After months of grueling attack, the great city of Cordoba itself falls to the rebels in a bloody battle.
Cordoba was burned down. Most of the city built by Abdurrahman III, Medinat al-Zahra, which is west of Cordoba, which he was built in as the most beautiful city in Spain at the time, but they really burnt it down to the ground.
The weeping of one who weeps, with an eye whose tears flow endlessly, is not enough to lament the loss of such as Cordoba. My heart is torn apart for its wise and forbearing men, its men of letters, and its men of taste.
This was a time of great upheaval when native Spanish Muslims turned against Berbers, when Jews and Christians became more vulnerable. It was, and really the best expression for this is an Arabic one, it was the time of fitna, of strife.
By the beginning of the 11th century, the unified Al-Andalus has enjoyed a cultural efflorescence. But without the authority of its great leader, Caliph Abdul Rahman III, Al-Andalus now begins to break apart, dividing into separate, smaller kingdoms called taifas. The glory of Cordoba is gone. The library is destroyed. Countless scholars perish in the violence of civil war.
As the library at Alexandria was un-Islamic, so was the corruption of Islam in Cordoba, and it was done away with according to the teaching of the Quran.
Among the many refugees who must now find new homes among the Taifa kingdoms are two young students, one Jewish and one Muslim. One finds tolerance, and the other, persecution. The Jewish student, Samuel ibn Nagrala, travels to the burgeoning Taifa of Malaga, in the now fractured Al-Andalus.
He was one of those who fled Cordoba because he came from a political family and they were out, so he had to go elsewhere. And there is a story that's probably just folklore, but it's a good story, that he had no way to support himself, so he got a job working in a grocer's shop. Well, in Malaga, he would have encountered all kinds of Arab intellectuals, and apparently it was possible for Muslim and Jewish and Christian intellectuals to interact.
But in his new city, Ibn Nagrala does not forget his beloved Cordoba. He laments the loss of his home in his poetry. Exile is ink in God's book, across my soul and every shore, and all on whom wandering is written are driven like Jonah and scavenge like Cain. The Muslim student, Ibn Hazm, wanders the broken land of Spain, moving from patron to patron, hoping to continue his learning in a life without conflict.
He was a royalist, if you want. He wanted to bring back the caliphate. And he would go to any general who claimed he was fighting for the restoration of the caliphate. So, but of course, his choices were always poor. He always went with the weak side.
In his writing, Ibn Hazm mourns the security lost in the civil war. I see before my eyes the destruction of that noble citadel, which I had once known as beautiful and prosperous, in the stable, well-ordered atmosphere in which I had grown up. Its courtyards, once full of people, now empty. With the fall of Cordoba and the rise of the many smaller Taifa kingdoms, each local ruler must compete for power, setting the Muslim leaders at odds with each other. As the years pass, word of Ibn Nagrala's reputation for scholarship spreads, and soon the Jewish scholar is invited to serve in the court of one of the most powerful Taifa kingdoms, Granada.
Granada is a kingdom which has a large percentage of Jews in its population and is also characterized by a diverse Muslim population. So it was really a complex situation, much like the caliphate had been.
Samuel ibn Nagrala is asked to compose letters on behalf of the Berber Vizier, or Prime Minister of Granada, who finds the scholar's work so impressive that he is eventually promoted into the court of the king himself.
From a scholarly point of view, he had two lives, if you want. One that he did in Arabic, that is the official one as a secretary of the ruler, and the other one in Hebrew. That is, he wrote poetry in Hebrew, and he even wrote some scholarly books in Hebrew.
But after many years of struggle, the Muslim scholar Ibn Hazm has no such success with his patrons. In Granada, the years have been kinder to the Jewish scholar Ibn Nagrala. He achieved such a high level of authority in the kingdom that in 1057 he is invited to lead the Granadan army, and he does so for the rest of his life.
He definitely accompanied the troops on their annual forays against the neighboring states, and we know a lot about his activities in that regard because he wrote poetry about it.
Samuel ibn Nagrila is, in some sense, the opposite of Ibn Hazm, in that he had a meteoric career. He rose to great heights. In fact, he couldn't have risen to greater heights without becoming king himself.
The Muslim Ibn Hazm is rewarded not with trust, but with persecution in the Taifa kingdom of Seville.
One of the aspects of the Taifa kingdoms at this point in time is that, along with each political faction, you often get different, divergent beliefs, religious beliefs. And Ibn Hazm represented one particular strand of those beliefs. And of course, his enemies were very glad to try to depict him as heretical.
This seems a good opportunity to explain why what they call Wahhabism is spontaneous in the last 100 years. It's nothing new. The problem to understand it is Islam has always enforced its beliefs by violent domination. But the beliefs were, and the expression by the caliph or the king authority figure in charge would vary from time to time. Most of the subjects were illiterate. So the interpretation that the leader had was what was enforced. And with the breakdown of who was the central authority in Spain, they all had their own interpretation to enforce. What is new today that people don't understand, the spontaneous eruption of a Islam they call Wahhabism or Islamist or something. It's just the Quran. The secret is all the madrasas, all the education, teaching them to memorize the Quran. It's literacy. It is this memorization of the Quran that makes the robots, and it's endemic today. So the true Quran is being expressed. It isn't because some Wahhabist expressed some opinion or some Muslim brotherhood at the medical university at Cairo, or some what they call them, the Brotherhood in Turkey for the First World War, the Young Turks, another product of the medical university that bled very well into the German cooperation in the First World War, helping Turkey, and then much of this ability to be savage picked up by the Nazis, which the Muslims joined the Nazis. But that's another thing. The point is, literacy has given a rebirth to true Islam according to the Quran. The other thing is, if you just check the worldwide growth of Islam in the madrasas and the like going on in Pakistan and all over in America, all over, it's oil money has funded a mushroom of literacy. There are people from America sending their children to madrasas in Pakistan. They can be indoctrinated for free. Okay.
Goodbye. Spoke his mind, at least from everything that he had written. He clearly didn't mince words. I mean, he was very blunt, very eccentric.
His career went from exile to prison to any number of, we might say, vicissitudes.
For people like Ibn Hazm, the fall of the caliphate and the beginnings of the Taifid kingdoms was the greatest catastrophe imaginable.
Indeed, with no central authority in Cordoba to unite its people, the rise of the Taifid kingdoms turns Muslim against Muslim, beginning a period of division and war. As the powerful Taifid kingdoms of Seville and Granada compete with each other for supremacy, they turn on the more vulnerable Taifid kingdoms to the north. In a bid for survival, these northern Muslim kingdoms send emissaries to the Christian kings with an appeal for help.
In exchange for payment of tribute, a financial payment, the Christian monarch would offer a modicum of protection against enemies. And so we end up with these complicated arrangements where you might see combinations of Christian or Muslim kingdoms in alliance against similar combinations on the other side. We wrongly imagine Muslims and Christians monolithically squared off, one against another. But part of this reality is that a Muslim ruler of a kingdom will see no shame in making a deal with a Christian king in the north if that can give him some protection for his kingdom.
The rise of the Taifid kingdoms forever changes Al-Andalus, shifting the landscape of Muslim power in Spain. By 1060, the Muslim-Christian alliances may have granted the smaller Muslim Taifid kingdoms a temporary reprieve from the aggression of the larger Taifas, but they also contribute to a growing demand among many Muslim and Christian leaders for a purification of their religion and of their land. In Rome, Pope Alexander II sees the intimate relationships between Christians and Muslims as immoral, and he seeks to purify Spain of all Muslims.
In the core of Christendom, they saw the kinds of relationships that Christians had with Muslims in Spain as a source of contamination, as a possibility of error, as a kind of traffic with the enemy.
While conflict builds in Christian Europe, religious tensions escalate in Al-Andalus as well, just as the Taifid kingdoms begin to fall apart. In Granada, a Muslim religious leader, Abu Ishaq, mobilizes a faction of Muslims against the city's Jewish community, preaching that a Jew or a Christian should not have authority over a Muslim.
It was instigated by a Muslim preacher who was also a poet, and he wrote a very scurrilous poem in which he attacked the ruler Badis for having this Jewish vizier. And it's a very nasty poem. It's long. It contains nasty attacks on the Jews, nasty attacks on the government for tolerating the Jews. It's the kind of thing you don't see much of in this period. It was virulent, and poetry had a lot of power because of the prestige of poetry.
Disgusted with what he sees as his society's moral ills, Abu Ishaq turns to violence.
His poem apparently was influential in whipping up the crowds. And probably it was the masses. Again, usually when there are attacks on the Jews, it's not usually government-sponsored in the period until the 14th century. it's usually some uncontrollable crowd.
Sadly, the mob's main target is none other than Joseph ibn Nagrallah, who has inherited his position as court vizier from his father, the great scholar Samuel ibn Nagrallah.
What accompanied Joseph's overthrow was not just the fact that he was removed from power or even executed himself, but a massive massacre in which 3,000 to 4,000 Jews of Granada were killed by the local population.
The medieval chroniclers give astronomical numbers, which are probably not accurate, and we don't need to worry about them. The fact that Jews were killed in the street is a bad thing, however many it may have been.
In northern Spain, Christian armies begin their form of purification as well, marching against Muslim cities, taking them by force, one by one, in their reconquista, or reconquest of Spain.
The Christian kingdoms begin to claw back first frontier land, then crown jewel cities.
In 1085, the Christian king Alfonso VI conquers the great city that marks the geographical center of the peninsula, Toledo. But the Christian king values Toledo's extensive knowledge and history.
One of the things that would be attractive about a city like Muslim Toledo is not to have an empty museum of buildings, but to have a thriving commercial center. Alfonso VI seems to have written documents or agreed to documents in which he referred to himself, or was referred to, as the emperor of the two religions. So this Christian king himself seems to have a concept of there might be a mixed solution, a mixed society that we can bring about here.
Threatened by the encroaching Christian forces, the Muslim ruler of Seville enlists armies from North Africa to help defend his kingdom, with disastrous results. The royal court of Seville enjoys the typical lavish lifestyle of Al-Andalus. They have no idea how their simple everyday life will outrage the North Africans.
The North African factions are appalled to see that their co-religionists appear to be drinking alcohol. They're appalled to see that their fellow Muslims are mingling with Christians and Jews so readily, because they are people who have a much stricter, much more by the book, much more rigid concept of how Muslims should live and work.
The ruler of Seville becomes the first victim of his own faulty plan. The North Africans send him to prison in Morocco and take his kingdom for themselves, setting in motion one of the most difficult and violent eras of Al-Andalus. The North Africans begin their new regime by burning controversial books from the libraries of Al-Andalus.
They saw an Islamic world, an Islamic kingdom, which had once been at the pinnacle of power, brought low by civil war, shattered, destroyed, now prey to the onslaught of Christian kingdoms. So they saw themselves as saving a failing state.
The North Africans see the root of this failing state in the unfamiliar, open, and diverse society of Islamic Spain. Over the next century, these North African armies flood into Al-Andalus. First, the Almoravids, then a new, more puritanical Muslim group, the Almohads, seeking to transform the diverse kingdom into a purely Muslim state.
There was a combination on their part of a moral duty and a political desire in order to conquer the society. And once they had conquered it, to transform it into something which they saw as morally appropriate.
Under the North African Almohads, Many Jews and Christians are forced to flee Al-Andalus. Entire families must abandon their ancestral homes or face humiliating persecution.
The Almohades certainly represent an authoritarian and absolutist perspective. They came and swept away the tolerant traditions of the Caliphate. Judaism and Christianity were simply outlawed.
The Almohades began to impose their ideals, and then the Andalusi society, or segments within the Andalusi society, began to feel that they were being oppressed and began to leave, in some cases preferring Christian rule.
In the dust of the refugees, the light of Al-Andalus, the land once known for its diversity, prosperity, and scholarship, is lost. But as they travel, these homeless wanderers never lose the culture of their birth. The Jews who find new homes in the Christian North carry with them not only their ancient Jewish traditions, but also the knowledge fostered in Al-Andalus.
They planted the results. It was these Jewish courtiers who planted the products of Arabic and Islamic scholarship in Christian territories and really helped to fructify these European territories. Conditions remained favorable for Jews in the Christian territories for quite a while. I mean, we often forget about that. We think of Islam good for the Jews, Christianity bad for the Jews. It didn't look that way in 1150. From 1150 to about 1250, it looked as if Christendom was the land of opportunity for the Jews.
While the Jews find comfort in their new lives in northern Spain, larger forces soon threaten their security, as violent religious fervor erupts in Christian Europe. The spirit of holy war is sweeping the continent. While the Muslim Almohades wage their religious war in Al-Andalus, Christian Europe is waging its own crusade against the Muslim world to the east. In a frenzy of purification and intolerance, the Christian Crusaders intend to cleanse the Holy Land of Muslims.
And for a couple of centuries, we have this intermittent series of expeditions into the Holy Land, ultimately unsuccessful, some of them deeply barbaric. Now, this crusading movement, of course, affects the mentality in Spain. So the Crusades bring, for example, a harshening of the rhetoric on the Christian side.
Understand that during these times, around the year 1000, the mass murder of the Islamic invasions of Hindustan were taking place. Those invasions that gave rise to the escaping Roma, or gypsies. Please remember, at these times, the gypsies were finding safety amongst the Christian areas and lived for 1,000 years, running around in their wagons, doing odd jobs and grabbing whatever was on the trees. I remember my grandma. They were in Pennsylvania. They'd come through once a year and come to the back door, and she would give them some food. But they carried with them the tales of the murder that was going on under Islam.
And conversely, on the Muslim side, we're getting these more puritanical dynasties from North Africa launching jihads into southern Spain to kind of shore up their beleaguered co-religionists.
By the 12th century, Christian and Muslim leaders have taken a violent turn toward religious purification in an effort to strengthen their position. Ironically, through this conflict, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish knowledge meet at a new crossroads as the borders of conquest and the barriers of culture shift. As conditions worsen, refugees continue to flee the puritanical rule of the Almohads. Among them, a gifted Jewish student, Moses ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, who will become one of the greatest philosophers in Jewish history.
Here you have a Jew who is extremely learned in the Jewish tradition, but also very well versed in the general intellectual, in the themes of general intellectual life, particularly in the sciences and philosophy. He was born in Spain, but he lived at a time of systematic persecution. Maimonides' family had to flee, though he always retained the memory of being from Sfarad. He calls himself Moshe HaSfaradi, Moses the Sfarad, the Sephardic Jew.
On his journey, the boy takes with him the passion for knowledge born in that broken city so many years before. Over the years, Maimonides travels from Spain into North Africa and on to Egypt, where he is welcomed into the court of its leader, Saladin, in 1165. In the 12th century, Toledo is a bustling city, filled with refugees from Almohad rule, many of whom who had been scholars in the intellectual communities of Cordoba and Seville.
So all of these things are percolating in Christian Spain, thanks in part to the rather tragic collapse of the Christian and Jewish communities in Muslim Spain.
This cultural center of Toledo is a small island of peace surrounded by warfare, as the Christian kingdoms continue their expansion into Al-Andalus. Outside Seville, the Muslim Almohad army holds strong against King Alfonso VIII and his Christian army at the Battle of Alarcos. The 15th century Muslim chronicler Al-Himyari writes of the day. The two sides met at the bridge of Alarcos, and a battle was joined. The enemy fled and were put to the sword from early morning to midday. The camp of the Christians was plundered, and about 30,000 of them were killed. Fewer than 500 Muslims found martyrdom.
When they faced the Christians, they defeated them, they routed them basically. And they forced them to a treaty that lasted, I think, some 10 years.
To the Christians, this Muslim victory is devastating and serves as a catalyst to unite the Christian kingdoms in one cause. In 1207, the Pope proclaims Spain a crusading zone and calls upon other European armies to join forces.
It was not only the Christians in Iberia that were fighting the Almohads. It was some sort of crusade. People had come from France, from Germany. All the crusaders came to defeat the Muslims, especially after the crusades failed in the East.
They march not only for conquest, but for what they believe God wants, a purely Christian Spain.
So this becomes Spain's crusade. And one of the popes, in fact, instructs Spanish knights that they shouldn't go off on these voyages to the Holy Land, that their job is to liberate their own country for Christendom.
It seems deep in the monotheistic religions that sacrificing your life for God is a tremendous value. It was definitely true in Christianity, and we're much more familiar with it in Islam today because of the suicide bombings. But the theme of martyrdom is obviously a deeply Christian theme as well.
There's something fundamentally wrong with what he's saying here about martyrdom. The children blowing themselves up with suicide belts, or going out and throwing rocks at police. There's something wrong with what he's saying between Islam and Judaism. I know Joshua destroyed villages and cities of people that were attacking them and that had a culture of child sacrifice, worshiping Moloch, that exterminating this evil cultures. But remember, the whole thing about Abraham was he didn't sacrifice his son. He was the archetype of not doing human child sacrifice. Please understand that, and what the Jewish did to make a safe place for children, that there was no child sacrifice. And to equate that to a violent cult that trains children to go out and murder themselves and murder other people as an act of serving Allah. Don't equate the two. Also, part of the Jewish Bible and tradition is the safety of the sojourner, that you could go through a Jewish area as long as you were respectful and you weren't in danger. And they didn't extend themselves the way converting people to Judaism by intimidation and terrorism. And they're trying to recover their homeland that was taken from them by terroristic murder. The same with the Christians trying to recover their Holy Land and to recover Spain or whatever. Look at the land of Armenia, the size of it before the Islamic invasions and genocides. Look at the pile of dead Armenians and the Muslim soldiers proud to have their picture taken. Men, women, and children, defenseless. Christianity didn't grow by violence. Most of the conversions in Europe were monarchs trying to help their people, to bring them out of some primitive religion and something that would help build a healthier society. Not the murderous stuff of Islam, where the children in Gaza, that they put their tunnels under where the children are, so that if Israel goes to destroy a tunnel, children might get killed. And it's an honor that those children, for those children, they are shaheed or whatever you call it, martyrs. They go directly to Allah and rewards. They don't go through any judgment like a normal person dying of old age. The same with these boys throwing rocks at the policemen and military. And the equating of Islam to Christianity, the murderous Islamic invasions of India and Pakistan, that area, and the Roma, that were the warrior class that were driven off their land for a couple of generations and then came to Christian areas and rode around safely in their wagons for 1,000 years. Yes, they're being destroyed and corrupted by going to the city and getting involved in urban life and child care and all the other garbage that goes on. But while they were going around the Christian countryside, they were safe.
Finally, the Christian army defeats the Almohad army at the decisive battle of Los Navas de Tolosa, led by King Alfonso VIII. In a message to the Pope, King Alfonso VIII recounts the slaughter. On their side there fell in the battle 100,000 armed men, perhaps more. Of the army of the Lord, only some 20 or 30 Christians in our whole host fell. What cause for joy and thanksgiving!
The Christians kept taking one city after the other.
The Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa is the end of Almohad rule in Al-Andalus, and it marks the beginning of the end of Al-Andalus itself.
When the Christians took it, they knew that they could not count on anyone to come and help them.
When I go to the building, I'm fascinated because, like Spain itself, it shows that Islamic base that, of course, sits on an older Visigothic foundation, out of which emerges this Christian thing, this Christian church, which is, of course, Christianity itself. So to me, that mosque, you know, that's why to me it really represents Spain, because it has all these different layers in there, mixed up together, inseparable in many ways.
After Cordoba, the other Muslim cities quickly fall to the Christians. The entire peninsula, except for the very southern tip, comes under Christian rule. Jews enjoy more acceptance under their new Christian rulers, living predominantly in urban centers where their skills in administration and business are in need. Some Jews find success as landowners, those familiar with the thriving agriculture of Al-Andalus.
There were things that the Christians needed from the Jews. They needed the population. They needed the skills that the Jews had in managing the territory. The Jews knew the irrigation systems, and they spoke the language of the population also. They spoke Arabic, whereas the Christian ruling class didn't. So there was opportunity for Jews.
In the beginning, Jews prosper in Christian lands, but over the next 100 years, their comfortable lives begin to suffer.
It gradually changed. As Spain became Christianized, Christians were able to take over, thank you very much. They now acquired the skills, and the skills that the Jews had became less important.
As the 13th century continues, the Christian public sentiment turns against the Jews of Spain. The Christian territories on the peninsula are now established and secure. In 1252, Alfonso X is crowned King of Castile and Leon, now the largest Christian kingdom on the peninsula.
In his law codes, Alfonso says that where someone is so unfortunate as to convert to Judaism or Islam, we order that they be put to death.
But in this period of tremendous change and upheaval, King Alfonso X proves to embody personally the very conflict that divides his kingdom.
In some ways, Alfonso X epitomizes the schizophrenia in a way that must have afflicted a lot of these medieval Muslims, Christians, and Jews.
While his punishments are harsh, Alfonso X's laws also allow for privileges and protection for the Jews and Muslims living under Christian rule.
Muslims living under Christian rule in medieval Spain were called in Arabic mudajjanun, in Spanish or in English mudahars. These are Muslims who lived under Christian rule and who were basically artists, laborers, they were builders.
Alfonso X allows these Muslims, as well as the Jews living under Christian rule, to live by their own laws, as long as they do not conflict with the laws of the kingdom.
He warns his Christian subjects that they must never annoy Jews or Muslims on their respective holy days because, he says, the temple, the mosque, is a sacred place where the name of God is praised.
Surprisingly, Alfonso X, the Christian lawmaker, is also a lover of Arabic poetry and the arts fostered by Islamic Spain.
Here is a king that his nickname is El Sabio, the wise or the learned, and truly he brings incredible intellectual wisdom to his kingdom, yet at the same time, like so many of these medieval Spaniards, he seems to have a great deal of difficulty trying to navigate his way through the problems that can emerge in a land of multiple religions in the Middle Ages. their intellectual toolbox would have been much different than what we have. And so there would have been a profound conflict sometimes between what their religion taught them or what they understood and what they might have been experiencing day to day in real-life interactions.
In 1348, the Christian conquest is brought to a staggering halt by an unexpected and deadly force from the east, the Black Plague.
When the plague swept Europe in 1348, it hit all of Europe with equal severity. And it hit the Muslim kingdom of Granada just as hard as it hit the Christian kingdoms.
Almost half the population of Europe succumbs to the disease. The countless deaths only feed the puritanical fervor in Christian territories. Hatred and violence erupts as Jews become the first scapegoats. As the plague ravages Christian Spain, there are few doctors for the sick and fewer soldiers for war. Thriving cities are decimated. Mighty armies collapse.
In some ways, you might say that the plague gave Islam a break in the Iberian Peninsula, because it created a set of social instabilities, political instability, civil wars in Christian polities, this kind of thing, that took the Christians' attention off of the war against Islam. So in that sense, I'm sure that the Muslims living in Granada when the Black Death came did not think of it as a good thing, but it did give them some breathing room over time.
Christian monarchs over the decades left Granada as a tributary that would pay a certain amount of money but would never be invaded. And from 1250 or so, all the way to 1492, there's this prolonged twilight of Muslim rule in Spain, no longer in any way a meaningful threat.
In 1453, again, events in the East occur that will change all of Europe. The ancient Christian city of Constantinople in modern-day Turkey is taken by Muslim Ottoman Turks. A 15th century Greek chronicler writes of a prophetic storm that precedes the fall of Constantinople. Such was the unheard of and unprecedented violence of that storm and hail that it certainly foreshadowed the imminent loss of all. And, like a torrent of fiercest waters, it would carry away and annihilate everything. The Muslim victory over Constantinople, the last bastion of the crumbling Byzantine Empire, is devastating to the Christians in Europe. In 1469, Christian Spain marks their commitment to a unified front. For the first time in 800 years, the kingdoms of Castile and Leon and Aragon are united with their monarch's marriage. Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand are joined in a lavish ceremony outside Toledo.
She was the queen of Castile, and he was the king of Aragon. And when they got married, they united Christian Spain.
So the two largest regions, they come together in marriage, and they are now united to campaign against that last holdout in the south.
For Isabel and Ferdinand, their conquest is not only of land, but of religion, with devastating consequences for the Muslims and Jews of Spain. With a strong Catholic monarchy ruling over Christian Spain, the Pope authorizes the Spanish Inquisition, a bloody investigation into the private religious lives of their people.
Originally, the Inquisition was meant to deal with Christians who were lapsed, not with Jews or with Muslims. But over time, it began to concern itself with converted Jews who had lapsed back to Judaism. And then, of course, once we have masses of Muslims who have converted to Christianity, it began to concern itself with converted Muslims, we call them Moriscos, who had lapsed back into Islam.
Queen Isabel names the priest Tomás de Torquemada as the Inquisitor General. A 15th century Christian chronicler describes Torquemada as the hammer of heretics, the light of Spain, the savior of his country, the honor of his order. Torquemada is to try and to punish those who have converted to Christianity but continue to practice their own faiths.
Please take the trouble to look at the reference I'll give here on the history of Inquisition. In fact, if you check this, you can get it online or at my website. I'll put a reference to it. But it shows that the punishment of the home Christians started before the Catholic Church was established by Constantine. Yes, there were bishops, and the corruption back into priesthood had started. You can read more about that at my website. But in fact, the home Christian churches were never destroyed, and they keep rebirthing themselves because the outlook of Christ has to do with family love and a direct relationship and thankfulness for our source of existence and a desire to live a purposeful life in the service of our source of existence, to make the world a better place because we're here. So the home Christians, often called Arians, were punished before Constantine established the Holy Roman Empire. And then the Inquisitions of the Holy Roman Empire were used against the home Christians. That has been continual. But so don't be carried away with the emphasis here. The worldly Catholic Church has punished Christians ever since its inception. Here's the reference to the history of Inquisition.
There was a lot of holding on to traditions for whatever reason, and this became exactly part of the problem that brought the suspicion of the Inquisition.
The Inquisition is often held up as the single greatest sign of the horrors of this Christian society that emerged in medieval and early modern Spain.
The Spanish Inquisition is one of the last tragic chapters in the history of Al-Andalus. Soon, Isabel and Ferdinand's dream of a unified Christian Spain becomes a reality. By 1487, internal strife in Granada's royal family allows the Christian armies to conquer the final Muslim cities surrounding Granada, leaving the capital city itself vulnerable to attack. Boabdil, the ambitious son of the Granadan emir, has rebelled against his father and joined forces with the Christian army.
So it was Castile's turn to capitalize on divisions within Granada. Boabdil, Abu Abdullah, became an ally of Castile because Castile promised to help him against his Muslim enemies.
Boabdil and his Christian allies launch a civil war against his father, laying waste to the land surrounding Granada.
During the course of the civil war, Boabdil switched sides various times. Twice he was captured by the Christian forces, twice he made a deal, and twice he reneged on it.
With the alliance broken, Ferdinand launches a siege on the walled city of Granada, and in January of 1492, Spain's last Muslim city finally succumbs to the Christian army.
Boabdil had violated a treaty which he had made with them, and they had every right to take the city.
According to legend, when Isabel and Ferdinand enter the city, they are given the gate keys by none other than Boabdil himself, as they tour the great silent halls of the Alhambra Palace.
Boabdil is part hero, part villain of this story. One of the contenders for rule in Granada. He makes an alliance with Ferdinand, and in the end, it's Boabdil who's the one in many Granadan eyes who really sells out his own kingdom.
After conquering Granada, Isabel and Ferdinand ordered Jews to either convert or face expulsion from their homeland of Spain.
We see it from the moment the Catholic kings, Isabel and Ferdinand, took over all of Spain and decided that Spain should be only a Catholic country, and how it impoverished the country. They said there was only one official version of Catholicism in Spain, and they started excluding anyone else.
The Jews who choose to leave Spain and settle elsewhere face a long and dangerous journey through the rough countryside. As refugees, the Jews of Spain carry their Andalusian culture and identity to new homes in Italy, as well as the Muslim lands of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Other Jews stay and convert, yet many maintain their ancient traditions as they have since they first settled in Spain almost 1,500 years before, struggling to keep their own culture in their new Christian world. In the centuries following the fall of Granada, Muslims are given the same choice as the Jews in 1492: convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Some converted Muslims called Moriscos continue to worship in secret, trying desperately to hold on to their traditions.
The reconquest of Spain by the Catholics and by the Christians created very much a sense of loss. And even until today, Muslims who visit Andalusia, who visit Cordoba and Granada and Seville, feel this nostalgia, feel this sense of loss.
Look, if you want to feel a sense of loss, go to Constantinople and that great church that's been turned into a mosque and then into a museum. Go to the Temple Mount and think how the Jews feel that they can't go and say a prayer at the Temple of David.
When there is diversity, there is, by definition, friction. But of course, if you eliminate diversity, wouldn't everyone be the same? There'd be no friction, but there'd be no creativity that results from that tension.
This is a con job. Look, I'll show you a clip that gives clear insight. Please open your eye.
People have to find a way to live together, find a way forward, despite some of the contradictions they feel, despite the fact that, you know, your belief is heretical in my eyes. But we're still here together in this city, and we may have shared values, and we're going to find a way to make this work for the good of our own children and families.
Well, hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle and this is Afterburner. And once again, we need to do something so simple, so obvious and logical that no one in the present political landscape seems to have the basic education, the courage, or the simple common sense to try to attempt. We need to look back, not way back, but well within living memory, to see what happens when the idea of tolerance merely becomes a code word for suicide. You know, we today cannot fully appreciate the transformational psychological horror that the First World War produced upon the world, but most especially upon the British Empire. In the Battle of the Somme alone, British casualties were, in one day, 19,240 dead, 35,493 wounded, 2,152 missing, and 585 prisoners, for a loss of 57,470 soldiers in one day. And of course, the Somme was just another abattoir in a war that produced scores of these horrors over 4 heartbreaking years, and which ended in nothing but bitterness, death, horror, and resentment. I think it's fair to say that it shattered the psyche of the British people in a way that they have never fully recovered from. But the lesson we need to draw from this as modern Americans is not about the horror of the battlefield. The real lesson for our times is the reaction of the British political class in the years following the Great War. You see, the revulsion and the shock and the horror of that war produced in the British elites an absolute psychological unwillingness to face such things ever again. They were so mortified by what they'd experienced that they simply refused to see the evidence of 2 decades building step by methodical step, and each new data point pointing ever more certainly towards a conflict that they, with a single magnificent exception, simply refused to face because they'd contracted a terminal case of moral cowardice. As Hitler grew in power, those British and French and American elites refused to see what was plainly before their eyes, namely, that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party were made of less sensitive, less noble, and less gentle stuff. Hitler's own German generals feared war even more than the French and British generals did, but Adolf Hitler had accurately read the Allied political leadership, and by a series of ever-increasing provocations, he continued to test his theory against their reactions, starting with minor transgressions to outright violations of the Treaty of Versailles, to annexation of territories and then entire countries, then to open shooting war. The British elites refused to see him and his ideology for what they were despite all the evidence. They preached tolerance and understanding. They bent over backward to make the case that they themselves, the victorious allies, were the cause of all of this rising evil. And the result of this weakness, this irresolution, this moral and physical cowardice was the creation of the certainty in the mind of Hitler and the Nazis that the West had become so weak, so morally decadent, and afraid that they would never fight again. That miscalculation led to the greatest disaster in human history. The Japanese made an identical calculation with regard to the Americans and were amazed that we simply did not surrender the Pacific after their attack on Pearl Harbor. No, it is weakness, not strength, cowardice, not courage, and resolute action that start wars. And it was the preaching of tolerance and acceptance of these challenges and intentional provocations by the liberals and progressives of the times that were directly responsible for those wars. And so today, starting 31 years ago, a totalitarian Iranian theocracy committed an act of blatant warfare against the most powerful military force in the world. They had bet on the weakness of the American president, Jimmy Carter, and the post-Vietnam weariness and disgust of the American people. The storming of the American embassy in Tehran brought them not overwhelming military response, but, like the British and French reactions to Hitler 40 years earlier, simply strongly worded diplomatic letters and behind-the-scenes sympathy for the so-called injustices they'd endured. The hostages, which had been held for 444 days as a banner of American weakness, were returned within hours of the election of a new president, perceived to be cut from somewhat stronger cloth. Now, since then, that radical Islamic philosophy, Shia terrorism exported throughout the world by Iran, and Sunni terrorism called Wahhabism, advanced by our good friends the Saudis, has been at war non-stop. not just with America in Kuwait and Iraq and Afghanistan, but in perpetual attacks against Jews in Israel, at war with Russia in Chechnya, at war with Hindus in India in the Kashmir, at war with African animists and Christians in Darfur and throughout the rest of Africa, at war with Buddhists in Asia, at war with the Chinese, with the Uyghurs, fomenting rebellions in South America, and so on. For the last 30 years, jihadi elements have pushed and pushed and pushed against the strength of their enemies and found, in Europe certainly, no strength at all. None. No demand is too outrageous for the progressives to cloak their fear and their refusal to confront a violent enemy as tolerance and respect for the very principles and actions that are antithetical to what they once held as irreducible core beliefs, back when they actually believed in something. Now, in America, Osama bin Laden made the same calculation of weakness and moral cowardice that Hitler and Tojo and Khomeini had made before him. But, unfortunately for him, the Jimmy Carters and Bill Clintons needed for such a gambit to pay off were not in office on that day. The unexpected and strong American response cost the Islamic Caliphate their stronghold in Afghanistan and the ancient heart of the Caliphate itself, Baghdad. Al-Qaeda put all their chips into Iraq, and thanks to a few 100,000 votes in the state of Ohio at the end of 2004, they ended up utterly defeated. So, after 9/11, no further attacks on American soil were forthcoming because there seemed to be, to their utter amazement, given what they see in our movies and our news media, unseen strength left in America. But now, weakness is the coin of the realm once again, and the provocations and challenges come faster and they're more daring. Bombers on airplanes, bombs in Times Square, massacres at army bases by Muslims in American uniforms. And in the aftermath of all of these, we are lectured that we need to be more tolerant, more understanding. We need to make more concessions and make more apologies. You know, the rhetoric of the U.S. State Department in 2010 and the British Foreign Ministry in 1938 are virtually indistinguishable. And if we do not change things, and very quickly, the results will be indistinguishable too. The very terms Islam, Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Hudna, Sharia, Caliphate, and all the others have been banned from being used by our own Defense Department. We cannot make plans to counter this enemy threat because we are not, by presidential order, allowed to even name them. And we will pay the price for this cowardice. And we may pay it on a scale that makes our losses in World War II seem almost quaint, practically nostalgic. Which brings me to the Cordoba Mosque being built near the wreckage of Ground Zero. Now, to those who have the ability to read, there's no question what this mosque is. It's not a modest house of worship for American Muslims seeking to peacefully practice their religion. One of those actually already exists. The Masjid Manhattan has existed peacefully for years. It condemns all acts of terrorism and denies any involvement whatsoever with the provocation of the Cordoba Mosque. You know, throughout the violent history of Islam, conquered provinces immediately have their most cherished symbols, churches, synagogues, temples, and so on, immediately converted into mosques. Now, this is to establish Islam's high water marks, to plant flags at the point of deepest penetration. They're very much like the little red flags that the British soldiers carried on the first day of the Somme to mark the limits of their advance against the enemy. Now, we are lectured daily that we must not only put up with all of this, but actually celebrate it, that compromise and tolerance and surrender are somehow now the defining American values. This mosque is being funded by foreign money. Its so-called moderate leaders have proven radical ties, and it will eventually be the pulpit for the Islamic takeover of America in the same way that trophy mosques in London and Paris and Oslo and Copenhagen and Berlin and all the others are. So the question is simply this. Is this a genuine house of peaceful religious worship, a place of mutual respect and tolerance to grow greater understanding, as we've been told, or is it something else? Well, ask yourself this. If this is as well-intentioned as we are told, who's doing all of the understanding and tolerating here? Are Christian churches and Jewish synagogues allowed in Mecca? They are not. Do Christian and Jewish and Buddhist and Hindu congregations meet every week to hear sermons about the destruction of the Muslim religion, the way that hundreds of millions of Muslims chant death to America and death to Israel and death to the West in their religious services every week? They do not. Do Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist believers call for separate treatment and their own legal systems for themselves in those few Muslim countries where they're allowed to exist at all? They do not. Tolerance, as it's being sold to us, is exclusively a one-way street, but a tolerant society is one that works both ways. Truly tolerant, moderate American Muslims would understand the pain and the provocation that this mosque generates among their fellow citizens, and if they genuinely believe in the mutual respect and understanding that they claim to want to create, why would they begin with such a poke in the eye to the people that they claim to want to improve relations with? American Japanese citizens did not insist on a Shinto shrine on the banks of Ford Island overlooking the wreck of the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor, because that is what mutual tolerance looks like. Giving up everything at every turn to people who give up nothing in return and whose response to charity and decency is merely to increase the outrageousness of their demands is not tolerance, and it's not decency. And it's certainly not moral superiority. It's not the highest ideals of the American character. It's cowardice. It's the unwillingness to face a threat proclaimed by loudspeakers all across the world every single week. It's the moral weakness to face the fact that for every ideology in the world, there is an opposing one that wishes for, plans for, prays for, and eventually executes its destruction. And it's one more data point that our pampered, idiotic, and self-proclaimed morally superior elites have reached a point of self-loathing and self-delusion that drives them to actions that are indistinguishable from suicide. Cowards, you see, have a moral, psychological, and intellectual imperative to claim that their cowardice is in fact strength, and their moral weakness is, somehow, simply because they say so, moral superiority. But those of us who still know the difference between mutual tolerance and compromise versus unilateral concession, surrender, and suicide, well, we have very little time left. About 2.5 months as I record this. Oh, and by the way, the same people tell us that we also need to be tolerant of the crime wave and massive illegal invasion of our southern border, and for the same reasons. Remember that in November, because, my friends, we are running out of time.
The history of Islamic Spain reveals the immense potential that lies in our shared values. Its triumph and tragedy compels us to embrace again a culture of tolerance and to heed the wisdom most sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews, to love God above all things and to love your neighbor as yourself.
But I'm interrupting here to say that the root of the problem has to do that the Jews are being rejected. The root of it came from Jews. They demonized the Christian church. The Jews were the Islamic enforcers, rent collectors, doctors, lawyers in Islamic Spain for 700 years. And when the Catholic Church, through the Visigoths, gained control in 1492, the same year Columbus discovered America, they inaugurated an Inquisition. There were Inquisitions going on way back. I am working on a book that has a good history, and I've mentioned that already. But the Jews that escaped to Northern Europe so demonized the Christian church, the Christian Catholic Church, for the Inquisition and what they were doing. But by the way, at the time Israel was created in 1948, there were 500,000 Jews in Turkey. The Jews in Turkey were the Jews outcome from the Jews being rescued. Turkey sent boats to rescue Jews from their Jewish helpers from Islamic Spain as it was being conquered. And now there's only about 50,000, and it's very unsafe for Jews in any of the Arabic world. Now, it was unsafe for Jews who did not help Muhammad. He personally beheaded 600 of the one tribe, and he then turned against people of the book. You can read that in the Quran. You can see what they teach the children in the madrasas and in the mosques.
Child Basmala on Prophet Muhammad and the Jews. Accurate TV, Saudi Arabia, May 7th, 2002. Saudi Arabia call-in number 0037-888-6531. Our report today will be a little bit different because our guest will be a girl. A Muslim girl, but a true Muslim. Allah willing, may God give us the strength to give our children the same education so that the next generation of children will be true Muslims who know they are true Muslims and know who their enemies are. This child will now introduce herself. She's the daughter of a sister in Islam, Huwaida, and of the artist Wagdi Al-Arabi. Her name is Basmala, and I will ask her too. Peace be upon you. Allah's mercy and blessings upon you. Peace be upon you. Allah's mercy and blessings upon you. What is your name, Basmala? How old are you, Basmala? 3.5. Are you a Muslim? Yes. Basmala, do you know the Jews? Yes. Do you like them? No. Why don't you like them? Because? Because they are what? They are apes and pigs. Because they are apes and pigs? Who said that about them? Our God. Where did he say that about them? In the Quran? He said that about them in the Quran. That's right. Basmala, what did the Jews do? What? What did they do? The Pepsi Company. So you know about the boycott too, Basmala. Yes. Did they love our Prophet Muhammad? No. What did the Jews do to him? He killed someone. Of course, our Prophet Muhammad was strong and could kill them. Okay, do you know the traditions about what the Jews did to our Prophet Muhammad? Is there a story you know? Yes. Which one? The one about the Jewish woman? What did the Jewish woman do to our Prophet Muhammad? The Jewish woman? Yes. She invited the Prophet and his companions. When he asked her if she had put poison in the food, she said yes. He asked her, "Why did you do this?" She replied, "If you are a liar, you will die, and Allah will not protect you. But if you speak the truth, Allah will protect you." And God protected the Prophet, of course. And he said to his companions, "I will kill this woman." Of course, she put poison in his food, this Jewess. Basmala, Allah be praised. May our God bless her. No one could ask for a more devout girl. May God bless her and her parents. The next generation of children must be true Muslims. Allah willing.
الجاي ان شاء الله لازم هم يبقوا المسلمين الصح كده نربيهم من وهم اطفال كده ان هم يبقوا مسلمين صح.
We must educate them while they are still children to be true Muslims.
What's left out of this story is that the woman's husband and brothers had been murdered by Muhammad and his companions as they ravished the village. They have to memorize it, and they have to learn Arabic, or doesn't count. You can find the true Quran at the University of Michigan, translated into English, or you can find it on my website. At any rate, they so demonized the Christian church with the help of Muslims, and demonized the Crusades, and demonized the Christian history, even though the Christians were exterminated. The land of the seven churches. It grieves me. And to study the Roma, the gypsies, they escaped from the extermination of over 100 million as Islam moved over into what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. And cover this with lies. But the demonization of the Christians came from this background because the Jewish were intellectuals. The ones that went to northern Germany were doctors and lawyers and accountants and businessmen, and their children go to university, and this is what goes into the university, this story that would demonize the Christians. And now that demonization of Christianity is projected into liberal America to not just demonize the Christians, but the Jews, the poor Muslims. And it's a fallacy. Put together a program that shows clearly the truth and the deception and the problem we have that has a genetic foundation, that the good is in the middle. There's evil on one side with homosexual liberation, and on the other side with Islamofacism, and both come from our genetic roots. One, the feminization, the manipulation to get control, and the other, the alpha male domination to get control. And in the middle, you can read about Christianity. And the demonization of Judaism, that the Jews are killed too. if you read the book, it's not like Muslims. It's people defending themselves and exterminating an evil culture that was killing them and had a cult of child sacrifice. Make a safe place for children to be respected. And that's demonized when you've got the Islamic cult using the Quran. The children memorize it and they're ready to kill themselves for Allah. That's child sacrifice. Wake up. Oh, by the way, if you're killed in the process of advancing Islam, then you go to Islamic heaven and get all kinds of rewards. Some Muslims are killed in Gaza because they put their tunnels underneath madrasas or places where children would be when they would be bombed. That those children were sacrificed to Allah and they go on to glory. That's they're a shahad. They're a martyr. Well, this is what Imam Rolf is putting forward, and PBS puts it out again and their name on it, and all these liberated academic people telling you. What are they telling you? Oh, let Islam come. It's peaceful. Look at the truth. It's a terrible lie. The peace is when they've conquered everything, and if you go on the street and don't behave the way the imam wants you to, look at how they're killing people because somebody accused them of tearing a page out of the Quran. Wake up. I need to end this now, but I would add one note. The good is in the middle. The alpha male Islamofacism on one side and homosexual women's liberation on the other side. One destroys the home and family by not giving a maternal nursing bond and a mother in the home and a father for the children. And the other destroys by domination and indoctrination, that you have robots, but at least the children are cared for. But in the middle is where we can live to serve our source of existence, this earth that we live in, and make it a better place and hopefully help intelligence in reality to escape before the natural destruction of this planet. Thank you.